December 1944, a column of German tanks pushes through a mist-covered valley. Their commanders confident the Americans are still miles away. Then, without warning, the earth erupts around them. No aircraft overhead, no guns in sight. Just precise, crushing blasts raining from nowhere. Panic spreads as steel crews realize they are being targeted by an enemy they cannot see. If you want more forgotten moments from WW2, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay till the end. The shock that struck those German tank crews did not appear out of thin air. It had been building for years quietly, methodically, and with a discipline that the German army never fully understood. By late 1944, while the Wehrmacht still relied heavily on visual range, line-of-sight estimates, and the instincts of experienced gunners, the United States had mastered an entirely different battlefield language, one written in angles, distances, plotting boards, and mathematics. American artillery was never meant to be dramatic. It wasn't built for spectacle or battlefield bravado. It was designed for something far more decisive: control. U.S. fire direction centers, survey teams, and long-range heavy batteries could strike with precision even when the gun crews never saw their targets. To the Germans, this felt unnatural. To the Americans, it was standard practice. Throughout 1943 and 1944, as the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, U.S. forces refined a doctrine built not around the moment of contact, but around the preparation before contact. Inch by inch, mile by mile, American survey crews mapped roads, ridgelines, valleys, and forests, turning the landscape into a grid that cleanly translated into firing solutions. Every point could be cataloged. Every enemy approach could be plotted. Once entered into a fire direction center, a gun miles away could be dialed in with mathematical accuracy. German tank commanders, trained under a philosophy centered on direct engagement and visual fire correction, were unprepared for this level of abstraction. In their system, artillery relied on what a forward observer could see. If the observer saw nothing, the guns stayed silent. It was a rigid cycle effective in clear weather, predictable terrain, and prepared offensives, but vulnerable the moment visibility broke down. In contrast, American gunners were engineers on the battlefield. Rain, fog, forests, and terrain folds that blinded German optics meant nothing to a U.S. plotting board. American units could fire beyond hills, beyond tree lines, and even beyond the horizon line if a single coordinate was known. Once a target grid was identified, the guns followed the math, not the eye. By December 1944, as Germany launched its final major offensives and fought desperately to slow the Allied advance, this contrast became painfully clear: a German tank crew could be miles from the nearest American soldier, hidden by foliage or terrain, and still find themselves under sudden bombardment. U.S. guns required no warning shot, no adjustment salvo. A single call for fire could bring an entire battery onto a target zone within moments. German accounts from the late war repeatedly mention a specific feeling: helplessness. Crews often wrote of being struck before they even understood the Americans had registered their position. Panzer units accustomed to maneuver duels suddenly felt hunted by weapons that seemed to fire from a different dimension. If the shells had come from aircraft, they could have braced. If from tanks, they could have counter-maneuvered. But when the impacts came from beyond sight lines, there was nothing to counter. No retreat direction felt safe. No advance felt protected. Much of this fear stemmed from the Germans' limited understanding of the U.S. network built behind the front. They saw the front line, they saw infantry, they saw armor, but they did not see the hidden backbone, the communication grids, the telephone lines, the forward observers tucked behind cover, the aerial spotters circling high above cloud layers, and the centralized fire direction centers calculating solutions faster than any German unit could respond. In small pockets along the Western Front, German officers began to suspect that American artillery could track them even without visibility, an impossible notion in their own doctrine. Some even believed the United States was using secret detection devices or long-range sound-ranging systems capable of pinpoint accuracy. In reality, the system was simpler and more efficient: disciplined coordination, mathematically trained crews, and overwhelming American industrial consistency where German artillery units often struggled with ammunition variations, barrel wear, and inconsistent powder charges, each requiring individual adjustments. American manufacturing delivered shells and charges so uniform that calculations remained accurate with minimal correction. Consistency became a weapon, one that compounded across every battery and every gun. This foundation built on precision, communication, and planning set the stage for the terrifying strikes that would soon hammer German tank columns with impossible accuracy. To the Americans, it was simply doctrine. To the Germans, it felt like lightning falling from a clear sky, and as U.S. forces tightened their advance, the gap between expectation and reality widened, leading directly into the deeper mechanics behind the American system. The true engine behind America's beyond sight. Accuracy was not a single weapon or unit, it was an entire ecosystem working in harmony. By late 1944, the United States had built something the German army never fully managed to replicate: a vertically integrated artillery network. Every layer from the aircraft overhead to the radio operators dug into muddy foxholes served a single purpose: locate, calculate, and eliminate to the average German tank crewman. The battlefield seemed chaotic and fragmented. But to the Americans, the same battlefield was a structured grid. Every hilltop measured, every crossroads logged, every probable German approach entered into layered firing plans. It was a level of foresight that turned landscapes into predictable patterns. U.S. commanders did not wait for German tanks to appear. They predicted where they would appear. At the heart of this system were the fire direction centers, the quiet, unseen brains of American artillery. These were not glamorous positions. There were no medals for sliding rulers across plotting boards or deciphering fire missions over static-filled radios. Yet these teams often determined the fate of entire armored engagements. Inside these cramped tents or sandbagged bunkers, soldiers trained in trigonometry and map work calculated firing solutions with precision that German units rarely matched. When an observer radioed a coordinate, the center instantly cross-referenced terrain maps, elevation data, and pre-surveyed points. Powder charges were selected. Barrel elevation and azimuth were computed. Corrections were minimal. The entire process could take less than a minute. To German crews trained around a slower, more segmented process, this speed felt supernatural, but speed alone did not explain the accuracy. America's advantage also came from its deep reconnaissance network, especially in the sky. While German aviation struggled under fuel shortages, maintenance gaps, and Allied air superiority, U.S. artillery spotter planes flew relentlessly. Small, slow, and lightly armed, these planes were vulnerable, but they were effective. Often flying low and weaving through cloud cover, they could mark German tank movements long before those tanks realized they'd been seen. Even when weather-grounded aircraft, American units did not go blind. Sound-ranging teams, using arrays of microphones and precise timing devices, could triangulate German battery positions. Flash spotting posts, hidden along ridgelines, tracked muzzle flashes in the night or early dawn. Each detection fed new information into the firing grid. In contrast, German units relied largely on trained observers positioned dangerously close to the front. When those observers lost visibility due to fog, smoke, or terrain, their artillery often went silent. American guns, on the other hand, thrived in exactly those conditions. Fog did not stop calculations. Smoke did not confuse a firing table. Darkness only made German tanks more audible to U.S. sound-ranging teams. This disconnection in doctrine was growing more severe by the month. Another factor tightening America's grip was communication redundancy. Every U.S. battalion was layered in radio networks, field telephones, and backup relay teams. If a wire was cut by enemy fire, another route existed. If radios jammed, runners connected the chain. The system was resilient, flexible, and built to outlast confusion. German Panzer units, however, often fought with strained communication. Tank radios varied in quality. Infantry liaison lines were frequently overloaded, and artillery calls sometimes lagged behind rapidly shifting front lines. A tank platoon commander under American bombardment could rarely summon counter-battery fire fast enough to make a difference. By the time a German battery returned fire, the American guns had already repositioned all these components spotters. Survey teams, sound ranging, plotting boards, consistent ammunition, and resilient communication created an overwhelming advantage. German commanders facing American lines increasingly reported being shelled without any corresponding clue of U.S. positions, but nothing instilled fear more deeply than the pre-registered fire zones Americans plotted. Long before German armor showed up, roads, bridges, forest clearings, and valley passes were all meticulously measured. If German tanks rolled into one of these zones, U.S. guns didn't need adjustment salvos. They simply unleashed to the Americans. This was preparation. To the Germans, it felt like prophecy, and as the front lines tightened, those pre-registered zones grew more frequent, more accurate, and more deadly, setting the stage for the terrifying first-hand experiences that German tank crews could never fully explain. Angle A, the human fear inside German tanks. German tank crews were trained to expect danger. They understood the terror of close-range ambush, anti-tank guns at crossroads, and dive bombers screaming overhead. But nothing prepared them for the violence that struck without warning, sound, or origin. Inside a Panzer IV or Panther, the steel walls that once felt protective suddenly became a trap. Every man inside that hull knew that if a shell landed close, the force of the shockwave alone could stun or kill. These crews depended entirely on their commander's vision and the feel of the battlefield. They listened for engines, scanned tree lines, and looked for muzzle flashes. When artillery landed unexpectedly, the first instinct was always to search for the source. But in late 1944, as U.S. artillery networks reached full maturity, German crews frequently found themselves under fire with no visual cues at all. No observation plane overhead. No American tanks on the ridgeline. No infantry flares lighting the sky. Just the chilling realization that someone, somewhere, had their exact position marked. The emotional impact of this cannot be overstated. Tank crews prided themselves on toughness, discipline, and experience, but this new threat bypassed all three. Veterans who had survived years of warfare now felt helpless. Some recalled the ground shaking violently beneath them before any sound reached their ears. Others described the unique terror of hearing nothing but their own breath inside their helmets. Right until the next shell landed dangerously close. Human instinct revolts in moments like this. The claustrophobic interiors amplified every vibration. Every rattle of loose bolts, every flicker of dust knocked from the turret roof. When the next blast hit, men flinched uncontrollably, gripping their periscopes or hatches as if they gave them control. But control was gone. American fire direction had removed it, leaving German tankers fighting not only the enemy, but their own rising fear. Angle B. Tactical reality. America's invisible reach. German tactical doctrine was built around visibility. If they could see the target, they could outshoot it. Panzer optics were legendary, clean, sharp, and precise. In open duels, German gunners often enjoyed the advantage. But American strategy increasingly removed visibility from the equation. Altogether, U.S. gunners didn't need to see the target. They needed coordinates. Once a grid square was identified, even briefly, American artillery could continue firing long after the spotter moved or the target disappeared. German tank commanders misread this again and again. They believed the Americans were firing blindly, expecting U.S. guns to stop once tanks pulled into cover. Instead, the bombardments followed them. If they tried to reposition, the shells adjusted with disturbing accuracy. The Germans were facing a level of battlefield integration they were never prepared for. Each U.S. artillery battalion had multiple observers, aerial spotter planes, reconnaissance patrols, and sometimes even liaison teams embedded with forward infantry. The result was a constant flow of data feeding the guns. German tank commanders quickly realized they couldn't rely on old instincts. Smokescreens didn't help. Forest cover didn't stop the bombardment. Even withdrawing behind a slope failed when American observers had plotted the entire terrain beforehand. Any position could be struck. Any movement could be tracked. American firepower was not simply strong, it was everywhere. And it hit long before German tanks could respond. Angle C technological edge, the math that 1. The battle behind every shell that fell beyond sight was a network of precision instruments and disciplined calculations. Americans treated artillery as a science rather than a battlefield accessory. Their plotting boards, range tables, meteorological data, and survey teams were not optional. They were the foundation of every firing mission. German units, often stretched by shortages and rushed deployments, relied heavily on manual estimation. Experienced gunners could compensate for barrel wear, powder differences, and environmental factors, but only after visual observation. Without eyes on the target, German calculations stalled. American units did not stall. Their system was engineered to eliminate guesswork. U.S. ammunition factories produced shells with near-identical weight, shape, and powder consistency. This allowed fire direction centers to calculate trajectories with extraordinary accuracy. Survey teams had pre-measured key terrain features months earlier. Meteorological units provided wind and temperature tables daily. Together, they created a battlefield environment where every shell behaved predictably. This precision terrified German tankers. When rounds landed close, despite fog, darkness, forest density, or uneven terrain, they assumed the Americans had new secret weapons. Some even believed U.S. forces used radar to track tanks, an exaggeration, but one that reflected the impact of American technological discipline. The truth was simpler. America turned mathematics into a weapon. And as German units discovered, there was no armor thick enough to protect against calculations fired from beyond sight. Angle D, leadership. The American system that never slept behind every precise American artillery strike was leadership that understood the importance of preparation. Commanders like General Omar Bradley and Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges believed that artillery was not merely a support branch, it was the backbone of the U.S. battlefield. Their doctrine emphasized overwhelming fire superiority, coordination, and sustained pressure. While German commanders often reacted to evolving situations, American leaders designed operations around pre-planned fire maps and interlinked batteries. Entire sectors of forest, fields, and rural crossroads were surveyed days or even weeks before any movement began. Before a single infantryman stepped into a valley, American commanders ensured that artillery could hit any point within minutes. This leadership philosophy created a battlefield environment where German tank units unknowingly entered landscapes that Americans already owned on paper. American officers watched the front line as a predictable pattern of enemy behavior. If a road led through a town, they knew German armor would eventually use it. If a ridge overlooked a key supply route, they knew German units would attempt to seize it. These anticipated movements were built into fire missions long before German tanks rolled forward. Meanwhile, U.S. liaison officers embedded in infantry units relayed real-time updates to fire direction centers. Combined with aerial spotting and forward observation posts, this leadership structure ensured a constant flow of information to German tank forces. This level of preparedness felt impossible. Their own leadership, strained by shortages, inconsistent communication, and collapsing fronts, was forced into reactive decisions. American leadership, by contrast, had the luxury of time, resources, and planning, and they used those advantages to devastating effect. Angle EA. Enemy misunderstanding. The German search for an explanation as American shells continued to fall from unseen positions. German crews struggled to explain the phenomenon. Their assumptions grew increasingly desperate. Many tank commanders believed the Americans had developed new long-range sensors or infrared tracking devices. Others speculated about high-altitude aircraft invisible in the clouds. Some even believed American artillery pieces were mounted on hidden rail lines, allowing them to reposition faster than German intelligence could track. These theories were understandable but flawed. The Germans didn't realize that the Americans didn't need exotic technology. They simply used well-coordinated networks, precise mapping, and disciplined mathematical systems. Yet from inside a tank turret, under relentless bombardment, the simplest explanation always felt unlikely. Fear magnified misunderstanding. Reports from captured German officers reveal astonishing speculation. Some believed American units had portable radar units tracking tank formations. Others were convinced that U.S. spotters could fire through smoke as if it didn't exist. A few concluded that American tactics were driven by some form of code-breaking or espionage. What they could not see was the truth. The U.S. Army had built systems that removed uncertainty altogether. German intelligence underestimated how thoroughly Americans surveyed terrain, how quickly they relayed coordinates, and how cleanly they executed fire missions. To the German crews who experienced it firsthand, American artillery appeared to defy logic, but the reality was far more straightforward. The Americans had simply mastered the battlefield through discipline and foresight. While German forces were forced to guess under pressure. Angle F. Psychological impact. The breaking of armored confidence. German armored doctrine was built on confidence in their optics, engines, armor, and gunnery. For years, Panzer crews had dominated the battlefield through skill and aggressive maneuvers. But shells from beyond sight changed everything. The psychological collapse began quietly. A few scattered units reported unusual bombardments that seemed too accurate. But as the war progressed, these isolated encounters grew into a pattern. Entire Panzer battalions found themselves under sustained fire long before reaching American lines. Tankers who once felt invincible now hesitated before entering open terrain. Commanders delayed advances, worried about pre-registered fire maps. Even experienced veterans developed habits of scanning the sky or ridgelines for dangers that weren't there. The fear was not of the explosions themselves, it was the uncertainty. When an enemy could hit you without being seen, maneuver meant little. Skill meant little. Armor meant little. In a profession built around precision and control, losing the ability to influence your own survival was devastating. German morale reports from late 1944 reveal this creeping dread. Crews began requesting additional reconnaissance before moving. Platoon leaders reported a noticeable decline in aggressiveness. Some units avoided known valleys altogether, even when ordered to advance. This hesitation slowed German offensives, disrupted timing, and gave American forces even greater freedom to dictate the pace of battle. American artillery did not just damage tanks, it damaged confidence. It broke the mental foundation of armored warfare. And once that confidence cracked, the battlefield shifted permanently in America's favor. This mounting psychological pressure created the conditions for the decisive turning point to come. By late December 1944, the German army attempted one final push, an armored thrust meant to punch through thin American lines and regain momentum. The terrain was harsh, the air icy, and visibility limited. Forests choked the roads. Valleys trapped fog like wet wool. German commanders believed these conditions favored them. Poor weather would ground American aircraft. Dense terrain would hide their movements. And the Americans, they assumed, would not expect an armored push through such constricted spaces, but the Americans did expect it. And they had prepared for it with mathematical precision. The valley chosen for the German advance lay between two steep ridges. To the naked eye, it looked like any other stretch of European countryside, simple, unremarkable, quiet. But U.S. survey teams had been here weeks earlier. They had measured the slopes, registered the crossroads, calculated the distance from every ridge to every clearing. They had plotted the valley as a likely German approach route and assigned it to multiple artillery batteries waiting miles away. The Germans did not. No, they were driving into a corridor already marked for destruction. At dawn, a battalion of Panther tanks rolled forward. Engines rumbling, exhaust fumes cutting through the fog. Infantry carriers followed closely. The crews were confident. Their tanks were powerful, their guns accurate, and their senses sharp. They moved slowly, scanning for threats, expecting anti-tank weapons or ambush at choke points, but the danger wasn't ahead. It was far beyond anything their eyes could reach, high above them, beyond the clouds. An American artillery spotter plane circled. It was small, slow, and easily missed from the ground. But it did not need to come close. The pilot saw the German formation stretching through the valley. With calm precision, he radioed a short message. Target column. Grid 27F fire mission. It was all the Americans needed. Miles behind the lines, fire direction centers went to work. Coordinates were plotted. Distances checked. Elevation calculated. Within seconds, the data flowed to the waiting artillery batteries. Crews adjusted their guns without emotion. Powder charges were selected. Shells loaded. Breeches closed with metallic finality. Then came the command that changed everything. Battery fire. A row of American guns recoiled in unison, belching smoke into the cold morning air. Their rounds disappeared into the mist. Arching silently toward the valley, the German tank crews heard nothing. Inside the lead Panther, the commander peered through his periscope, scanning ahead for threats. Everything appeared calm. No flashes on the ridgeline. No movement in the tree line. The fog muffled distant sounds. His crew relaxed slightly, believing they were still miles away from American contact. Then the world split open. A massive explosion tore into the valley floor behind the column, shaking the ground with violent force. Before the crews could react, a second blast landed near the lead tank, showering it with earth and steel fragments. The commander shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by a third explosion, this one even closer. Panic rippled through the formation. Some tankers were convinced they were under air attack. Others searched desperately for American guns on the ridgelines, expecting to see flashes. But the fog remained still. The tree line remained silent. Nothing made sense. The explosions were too accurate, too sudden, too perfectly placed. Inside one of the tanks in the middle of the column, the gunner pressed his helmet against the steel hull as another blast rocked the vehicle. Tools clattered. Dust rained from the turret roof. The loader struggled to keep his footing. None of them could tell where the fire was coming from. What terrified them most was not the violence, it was the invisibility. Then the second salvo arrived. American gunners had made slight small adjustments based on spotter feedback. Each shell now landed closer to the German armor. One round struck the embankment, flipping earth over a half-track. Another landed directly beside a Panther, lifting it on one tread and slamming it back down. Tank commanders shouted over radios, demanding reports, trying to form coherent responses, but the network was overwhelmed. Static, overlapping transmissions and panicked shouting muddled the airwaves. The fog acted like a trap, amplifying the blasts inside each turret. The Americans were not firing blindly. They were hitting a pre-registered kill zone with mathematical discipline. The German column stalled. Vehicles attempted to reverse, but the valley was too narrow. Tanks collided. Half-tracks skidded into ditches. The smoke of explosions mingled with fog, becoming a suffocating blanket that blocked vision even further. The American spotter watched the chaos unfold, circling high and steady. He did not need to see clearly, only enough to confirm that the shells were hitting the grid square. With quiet confidence, he radioed again, fire for effect. This was the moment German tank crews would remember for the rest of their lives. Dozens of American guns unleashed simultaneously. The sky above the valley filled with invisible arc shell after shell. Descending with terrifying precision, the German armored column was no longer advancing. It was being dismantled, and this was only the beginning of the collapse. The moment the American spotter uttered, "Fire for effect," the battle passed the point of no return. The German column, once confident in its armor and firepower, now resembled a trapped animal caught under a falling sky. The valley that had seemed a safe route minutes earlier transformed into a killing ground, one carefully prepared by American artillery months before a single German tread touched it. The first full barrage landed like a hammer strike on steel. A Panther at the front of the formation took a near-direct hit. The shell detonated beside its right track, shearing off the road wheel and throwing shrapnel through the side armor. The crew inside, stunned but alive, attempted to evacuate. As the commander pushed the hatch open, another explosion erupted behind him, the blast wave slamming the hatch shut with brutal force. He collapsed back inside the turret, dazed and bleeding. Further down the line, a Panzer IV was struck along the turret ring. Though not a penetration, the concussion jammed the turret, locking it in place. The gunner screamed in frustration as his optics shook violently, cracks splintering across the glass. They still had not seen a single American tank. Not one. This was psychological warfare through mathematics. American artillery crews operated far to the rear, adjusting only when the spotter confirmed the effects. The fog covering the valley was irrelevant. The shells were not searching. They were arriving precisely where the Americans intended them to land. German attempts to respond quickly fell apart. The battalion commander radioed frantically for counter-battery support, but the artillery observers behind him were buried in the same fog, blind to where American guns were positioned. Without visual cues, German artillery could do nothing. They were reduced to guessing the source of fire, an impossible task against an enemy they could not see. American spotter feedback continued to refine the strike. Shift 2 5 meters east. Column compressing. With those calm, measured words, the destruction intensified. The second volley battered the valley floor. A half-track carrying infantry was lifted clean off the ground by a blast, flipping onto its side. Soldiers spilled out, scrambling for cover that did not exist. Their shouts were swallowed by the thunder of artillery impacts. Trees snapped like twigs, branches raining down in splintered plumes. Another Panther, farther back, attempted to reverse out of the kill zone. Its engine revved, treads biting into the soft earth. But the narrow valley road was clogged with burning vehicles and shattered debris. There was no escape route, only a funnel of confusion and fire. The driver hesitated, unsure where to steer. That moment of hesitation proved fatal. An American shell detonated just meters away, punching shrapnel through the engine deck. Flames erupted instantly. The crew bailed out, ducking into the fog, stumbling through smoke and debris. But the fog that once protected them now disoriented them, turning the valley into a maze of noise and terror inside another tank. The loader, barely 20 years old, tightened his grip on the ammunition rack as the hull shook from yet another near hit. His knuckles turned white. The turret rattled like an iron drum. He could hear his own heartbeat louder than the explosions. The commander shouted to move forward, then shouted again to reverse, confusion blending with dread as he realized the bombardment was adjusting with alarming speed. The Americans weren't firing saturation shells. They were firing precision shells. Every correction brought the rounds closer, tighter, more lethal. German crews believed the Americans had somehow locked onto them, but in reality, the Americans had locked onto the valley itself. They owned the terrain through preparation. Not through sight. The German armored thrust was breaking. The battalion commander, unable to restore order, finally issued the call no Panzer officer ever wanted to give: full retreat east slope. But the retreat was impossible. The valley walls were too steep, the foliage too thick, the vehicles too damaged. As tanks attempted to turn, some skidded into ditches. Others collided in the chaos. Engines fried. Tracks tore. Radios cut out. The entire formation was collapsing under invisible pressure. American guns continued without mercy. Battery after battery unleashed synchronized volleys, turning the fog-covered battlefield into a thunderous storm of steel. The Americans did not need to see the destruction. They heard the spotter's confirmation. Rounds landing accurate. Continue fire. German morale broke completely. Crews abandoned tanks. Men sprinted through mud, slipping and stumbling as explosions threw earth into the air around them. Some tried to hide under destroyed vehicles. Others crouched behind embankments, praying the barrage would move elsewhere, but the Americans were not shifting fire. They were finishing the mission. By the time the final salvos fell, the German armored thrust was no longer a threat. It was a shattered line of twisted metal. Burning fuel and disoriented survivors? The fog did not hide them. It held them in place. Every advantage they believed the terrain would give them had turned into a trap. American discipline, planning, and artillery coordination had dismantled a powerful armored battalion without ever exposing a single gun to German fire. This was the moment where German crews finally understood. The Americans did not need to see them to destroy them, and the aftermath of this realization would ripple across every German armored unit still fighting. When the final American volley ceased, the valley fell into an eerie silence. Smoke drifted slowly above the mangled German formations. The fog that had once concealed their approach now hung over scenes of devastation: burning engines, shattered treads, cracked armor plates. The entire battalion that entered the valley with confidence had been reduced to wreckage in less than an hour. American spotter planes completed one final circle overhead, confirming the results before peeling away to report back. To the gunners miles behind the lines, the battle had been a series of coordinates, corrections, and steady commands. But the impact of their discipline reached far deeper than twisted steel. It struck at the very heart of German armored doctrine. Reports from surviving German crews captured later revealed the scale of psychological shock. Many described the bombardment as inhuman, unseen, and impossible to counter. Some believed the Americans had developed new technology that could detect tanks through terrain. Others insisted that aircraft must have been guiding each shell despite the heavy fog that had grounded most Luftwaffe activity. None could understand how artillery, firing blind, could deliver such punishing accuracy. American commanders understood the truth. It was not magic. It was not luck. It was preparation. Fire direction centers later noted that the German column never stood a chance. The valley was pre-registered weeks before the engagement. Every crossroad, slope, and clearing in the battleground was already plotted. American survey teams had turned the terrain itself into a weapon long before the Germans entered it. The moment the spotter confirmed the enemy's presence, American batteries executed a mission that was essentially pre-written for the Germans. This represented a new and terrifying reality. The battlefield was no longer governed by what they could see or avoid. It was governed by what the Americans had already measured. Survivors who retreated east carried this message with them. In later engagements, German crews approached valleys and forest roads with far more caution, often delaying movement until additional reconnaissance was available. But time was something Germany no longer had. Every hour spent hesitating gave American forces more opportunity to tighten their advance. The impact extended far beyond this single valley. Short-term consequences: Panzer divisions that once prided themselves on fast, decisive action now struggled under constant artillery threat. Their mobility, previously their greatest strength, was stifled by the fear of invisible fire zones. Commanders had to alter routes, avoid predictable corridors, and disperse forces more widely to reduce vulnerability. But dispersal weakened their ability to concentrate firepower, especially when fuel and spare parts were already critically short. Meanwhile, American forces capitalized on the broken momentum. Infantry pushed forward with newfound confidence. Tank destroyer units maneuvered aggressively, knowing that artillery had already inflicted heavy losses on any surviving German armor. Supply lines strengthened. Morale surged. American units understood they had achieved something more than tactical success. They had demonstrated complete control over the battlefield's geometry, long-term impact across multiple fronts. American fire superiority became a defining characteristic of late-war operations. From the Hürtgen Forest to the approaches of the Rhine, German units repeatedly encountered precise, devastating bombardments that seemed to strike without warning. The Valley engagement was only one example of a larger shift, one that reflected America's ability to combine industry, mathematics, and communication into a single dominant force. German commanders attempted adjustments. They emphasized rapid movement between wooded areas, revisited long-forgotten camouflage practices, and ordered increased use of deceptive maneuvers. Still, nothing could fully counter an army capable of converting terrain into firing grids. When American survey teams moved across Europe, they were not merely measuring the land, they were shaping the battlefield of the future. Every ridge they recorded, every map they corrected, Every telephone line they laid was another step toward ensuring that no enemy unit could move freely. Reflection, a new kind of warfare. The Valley bombardment marked more than a defeat, it marked a turning point in the evolution of warfare. The idea that a force could destroy armored formations without seeing them rewrote the expectations of ground combat. Technology, planning, and coordination now outweighed raw armor, speed, or battlefield intuition. For German tank crews, the lesson was brutal and unforgettable. Their steel beasts, once symbols of dominance and tactical superiority, became vulnerable in ways they had never imagined. No amount of training or bravery could counter an enemy that fought with maps, mathematics, and invisible reach. For American forces, the engagement validated decades of doctrine and training. They had proven that firepower was not just about strength, it was about intelligence. It was about systems that amplified every shell, every calculation, every radio call. This mastery did not end with the war. It became the foundation of modern artillery operations worldwide. As the smoke finally lifted over the ruined valley and the sounds of battle faded into cold winter air, one truth became undeniable. The Americans had introduced a new era of battlefield dominance, one where the enemy could be destroyed long before they were ever seen.